This video is part 3 of the post-event survival community school videos. This is probably going to be the last one unless we come up with an idea for another first-person video. After we did part 2 on the supplies and items to look for to stock in your school or for your school for post-SHTF, shit hits the fan. Iron Combat Cameraman, who's not here right now because he had to work, we sat down and we've just been having this conversation back and forth of, well, what could be considered the criteria for you've been to school long enough, you've graduated, you're ready to join the community to be on your own. When are you independent and that type of stuff? We've also discussed, what would take the place of college and high school, your post-secondary and your secondary educations. And we thought of apprenticeships. Now, in an apprenticeship, the learner is basically contracted to the person who is an expert in that field to learn the ropes, learn the skills till they've learned enough and they're no longer an apprentice. They're now the person who does the task or someone who's qualified to do the task. And what we figured on this should probably start around the age of maybe 16 or 17, which that correlates over to high school nowadays, or at least when we were in high school. Your last year to 2 years of high school is when you really concentrated and arranged your classes for the occupation or the work you thought you wanted to do once you got out of high school. So if you wanted to go into business, you did the business classes. You wanted to do education, especially in a particular area, well, most of your classes were that area. Say you wanted to get a degree in mathematics, you were going through getting your higher level mathematics, like your calculus and that stuff, in your later year to 2 years in high school before you went on to college to get your actual degree. So we figured maybe do something like that. You go through, you get your base learning up to the age of 16 or so in the survival community school. You get your learning on history, mathematics, sciences, social studies, English language. You get your good core on that stuff, so you got the base education to get you through life. Now you need to figure out, what do you want to do with your life? So really, it should be the student's choice, okay, that individual's choice. But I argued you could find yourself in a community, though, where you're going to have a skill that is necessary for the community, but no one wants to learn that skill. Well, if that student has the knowledge, dependability, the skills and that stuff to be able to do that position, maybe they might have to take the apprenticeship to take on that position when the person who currently fills it can no longer do those duties. Now, apprenticeships are a thing that should be done for your little bit more technically skilled jobs or more knowledge-based jobs, something that's not entry level. So you're not going to do an apprenticeship to be a ditch digger. You're not going to be an apprenticeship to be a woodcutter, because that's stuff that you can learn on the job, OJT. So some of the jobs that I could come up with that I could see apprenticeships being done for, these are positions that you likely will need inside your community. First off, carpenter. And they should get a good rounding on the skills as a carpenter, not just for building homes, building barns, repairing them, but also your cabinetry work. Being able to build basic furniture, and I would put in there too, depending on how long the SHTF situation goes, learning how to build horse-drawn wagons. And before someone says something, yes, I do know in The Walking Dead they were making wagons out of old automobiles. I'm aware of that. But it may come to a day where it's decades into the future. We now have to make more purpose-built type wagons for particular jobs, particular cargoes, that type of stuff. Well, you need to have someone who has the knowledge, the skills to use hand tools to be able to do it. So I could see apprenticeship on carpentry being a thing. Another is apprenticeship on blacksmithing. The person who would probably be your blacksmith would be a person who was running a weld shop or a metal shop before everything fell apart. Well, that was always an apprentice position through history. Someone had to be taught by an actual blacksmith, so that's another one. Next job, plumbing and septic. That's really going to come into play, especially right after SHTF. You know, your town's sewage system is going to fill up, and you're going to have to go to something else. You're going to have to go to a more home-based septic system. Plumbers are the number one people to be able to do that job. Well, stuff involved with plumbing, you usually have to get an apprenticeship on that before you get licensed as a plumber. Another position is electrician/electronics. The stuff's always going to be around. You should probably have someone who still remembers the knowledge on that stuff so they can build a radio set from scratch if need be, repair a radio set, or any other types of electronics that you may come across. Let's say you decide to put in, say, wind turbines connected to automotive generators to produce electricity for a home. Well, you should have someone who has an understanding on home electrical and also how to set that up. Another position would be gunsmith/weaponsmith. We all see the commercials for the gunsmithing schools. Well, guess what? You also have weaponsmith, person who makes bows, crossbows, a fletcher who would make the arrows, you know, the person who would make the spears. Typically it was the blacksmith that made the swords and the knives, but all that comes into it. Another one I could see is farmer and herdsman. Okay, as Antifa found out in the CHOP or the Chaz up in Portland, Oregon in 2020, gardening is a little bit more complicated than tossing some dirt on the ground, putting some seeds in, and then sprinkling a bottle of water over the top of it. There's a lot of knowledge that you need to have to be able to farm effectively. And in a survival community, you need as much food as you can produce. So that's a position I could definitely see where you could have an apprenticeship for a few years. Obviously also a herdsman or a shepherd. Animal husbandry is a skill. It takes a long time to learn it. So apprenticeships on that. Another one is baker. Someone to bake bread. This was pretty common in communities where you had the one person whose job was to make the bread for the community, and then everyone came in, traded with that person to get their loaf of bread so that they didn't have to devote a chunk of their day to do that. They could concentrate on doing the other work that needed to be done to earn their living. Another position that I could see, especially longer term, post-SHTF or post-event, is cobbler, bootmaker. That's a dying skill. That's a dying trait. My great-grandfather was a cobbler back in the day, back before shoes were made quickly and easily in a factory. He used to have to make shoes from scratch using leather that he got from the farmer and wood and that stuff to make the soles. And then later rubber as he would get a hold of that. And then he had to put all that together into shoes and boots for use in his community, in his town. Along with that, another job I could see is a tailor and a seamstress. Someone who makes and repairs clothes. This is a skill that gets learned over time so that you can do it correctly, do it effectively, so that those seams don't come apart on that piece of clothing. It takes skill, it takes practice. Another one that I could see is brewmeister and distiller. The person who runs the brewery, the person who runs the distillery. Alcohol is going to be important, especially as a disinfectant. Well, you're going to have someone who understands how to distill alcohol. That does take knowledge. It takes training. And beer meisters, they spent their lives learning how to perfect being able to make beer, because you can screw it up really easily. Another job that I could see for apprenticeship is a mechanic, especially early in SHTF when you still have access to the fuels and that stuff, parts to keep engines running and that stuff. Someone who is skilled to be able to repair that stuff. And hopefully someone who has the knowledge and skills that they can take a part that's close enough to what's needed for that motor, modify it to get it to work, even if it wasn't specifically built for that particular motor. And those motors may not necessarily be in cars. Those motors could be running the grindstone at the mill for making flour. Or it could be used to run the pumps to draw water out of a nearby reservoir, nearby body of water, a lake or a river, to supply water for the community yet through the piping system, so they don't have to necessarily go down to that water source with a couple buckets every morning. Next one I should throw in here right away because I mentioned it, a flour miller. Someone who not just knows how to grind the different grains in the corn to make the meal, to make the flour, but has a good knowledge on how to build what you need to run that mill. I know some people are going to say, well, everyone should have their own grain mill at home to be able to do this. Not everyone is going to. Just because you do does not mean your neighbor does, and the neighbor on the side of them or the other one's going down the street. A community mill was very important back in the settler days. There's a reason why that was one of the early things that every community built. Another position that would require apprenticeships, medical/herbalist. Why do I say herbalist instead of pharmacist? Let's be realistic. A lot of your medications post-SHTF are going to be got from nature. It takes knowledge to be able to identify the stuff and know how to properly prepare it into medicines. And then obviously doctors go to school for a very long time to get signed off on. They understand how to maintain the human body. So that's something that really we're probably going to have to go to an apprentice getting taught on how to do that job until they are proficient themselves, that they can be an additional doctor in that community or replace the doctor in that community once they can no longer do the position. Another one that I could see is potentially teacher. So then the apprentice to the teacher would be a teacher's assistant. They're learning the ropes, how to interact with the kids, how to write up the education plans, how to properly teach it. You know, which things should be taught on a whiteboard, which has to be taught hands-on, that type of thing. Another job that I could see requiring apprenticeship, butcher/sausage maker. Person has the knowledge on how to properly butcher the animal, to preserve as much meat as possible, to get it out there for people to use. Sausage making it also requires a lot of skill and a lot of knowledge to do correctly, especially when you're trying to do sausages that are going to last a little bit longer term. So if you're trying to make those salamis or maybe those hams, whatever, so that you can preserve the meat to last through the winter into the next year until it is time for the next culling of the herds to do the next round of stuff for the next year. Another position that I could see requiring an apprenticeship or would likely need an apprenticeship would be handyman / maintenance person. Your jack of all trades, that guy that goes around town, you know, he can paint your house, replace your windows, replace that door, you know, remodel that bathroom, fix that roof, whatever. It takes a lot of time to learn those skills. And then you could throw in there maintenance, being able to maintain machinery and stuff out of workshops and that. Let's say the blacksmith still has a lathe that still works. Something breaks on the lathe, he can't use it right now, calls that handyman over. The handyman repairs it if possible. Another one that I could see is printer / paper maker. You're still going to want to have books. You're still going to want to make books. People are going to want to write stuff down to preserve things for history, to pass on knowledge. You know, you're probably going to have to literally make yourself your Gutenberg style press, and you need to understand how to make the inks for it, how to make the paper to run through that printing press, how to bind the books to pass out. That required a lot of skill and a lot of training through people's lifetimes before they were considered, you know, proficient enough that they could be a printer themselves. Another thing that I thought of here as I'm going through this is potentially hunter-trapper. Maybe have an apprentice who will tag along with that community's hunter-trapper to learn the skills, to look for the signs, know which proper trap to put in, how to properly assemble it or put it together so that you can catch that game. You know, what are the quirks for trying to take down that moose, that elk, that deer? That takes lifetimes of skill too that you continuously work on through your entire life, but I could see that being an apprenticeship also. Now, what about the kids that don't want to be an apprentice? They just want to finish up school and do their thing. That's going to happen. Well, those kids better be really handy with a shovel, because they're probably going to be the ones who are going to have to clean out the outhouses to dispose of the sewage. They're going to have to be the ones to dig the ditches, to dig the graves and to fill them, to sweep the streets, to clean the horse manure up off the street, and to collect up the trash in the community so that you don't have rat problems. But that's what we could come up with for the possibility of a high school level education. Now, I would probably recommend, especially for that 16 to 17 range, that maybe they'll start out with, they'll do the apprenticeship for like half the day, and then they'll still do their schooling for half the day. And then once they get to 17 or 18, that's when they switch over to, you know, they're working at the apprenticeship full time. That is their schooling. That's now their job going into the future. I'm sure some person will probably bring up, what about midwife or, you know, any of these other jobs? Of course, I'm sure there are a ton of jobs that I didn't think of and combat cameraman didn't think of that could fall in this category of requiring an apprenticeship to get good at it for taking care of your community or helping out your community. Now, for all my engineer brothers and the Patriot Militia movements, always remember, essayons.